Welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi K. Begay, and this is episode 125, Jason Heath's podcast journey, creative ideas for your next online project. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to another Flute 360 podcast episode. I'm excited to share this content with you today because it holds a special place in my heart. As most of you know, I started my podcast back in 2018, which was actually my DMA thesis. So fast forward 2 years later, and I have seen substantial growth. Not only as a flutist, but more importantly, as a human being, a continuous learner, and as a businesswoman. So right now, I know times are somewhat difficult, and I want to be a shining light for you. I have been in the gutters in past seasons of my life, and the friends who have surrounded me during those times were a godsend. I want to be that person for you. So this series is dedicated to you, the listener. Since I have seen personal, professional, and financial growth come directly from the Flute 360 podcast, I thought, why not share this information with others? How cool and how neat would it be for you to launch your own blog, podcast, or YouTube channel? I focus on these online platforms because our world is turning virtual more and more every day. So why not start now? And why not start with someone who can be with you every step of the way? Contact me today through WhatsApp, my website, or email so we can chat. You can reach me at heidikbegay.com and heidikbegay@gmail.com. I would love to hear your creative ideas and help turn them into a reality for you. Not just so you can be seen and heard, but so you can add another stream of income to your business portfolio too. So for today's content, let's listen now to Jason Heath's podcast journey to see what amazing opportunities arose from his podcast, Contrabass Conversations. Enjoy. Hi, Jason.
Hey, Heidi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. How are things in your neck of the woods? You're in Dallas, Fort Worth area, right?
Yes, Fort Worth.
Fort Worth. Okay, cool.
And
cool. Is it hot?
Oh my gosh, it's so bad. It's like 100 degrees, and I just want to run away to Wyoming or Montana.
Yeah. Well, I live in San Francisco, which is typically 50 to 70 degrees, but we've got this heat wave going on. Although today's a little better. It's actually only 62, which is great. But anything above, nobody has air conditioning here. So anything above 75, it gets to be a pretty sweaty city. So it got up to almost 100 on Friday last week, which is pretty rough.
Yeah, that's our norm. That's every day.
Yeah.
And you can't even now with the quarantine, you're like, oh, if I can just go outside and get some fresh air. No, you are totally bound to your apartment for the AC. But, c'est la vie.
Yeah, we're entering fire season here. So we've got all these forest fires right now. So now there's no AC. So you have the wonderful choice of sitting inside and sweltering or opening up and having literally, I think it was the worst air quality in the world on Saturday, Sunday this weekend come into you. So yeah, it's a funky time, but that's okay. I love Fort Worth. I was last time I was in Texas was actually for TMEA in February this year. So not Fort Worth, but San Antonio. And I've been to Dallas and Fort Worth actually a bunch of times for various purposes. So I love that area.
Yeah. No, San Antonio is really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Riverwalk and TMEA, they always do such a great job for their conventions.
Yeah. Have you presented there related to the podcast or otherwise?
Not yet. That is something
Okay.
that I'm trying to get into. I have been presenting at the National Flute Association. So that is really cool. That's our motherboard
Okay.
for us flutists. And of course, Team EA is really crucial too. I went to Team EA last when I was a DMA student. And so our flute choir and the wind ensemble, we got to perform. But I haven't yet really dove into proposing, my applications for the podcast. But that's something I definitely want to get into.
Yeah, I know that's, they have a whole tech where you may remember this, or maybe it's changed since you were last there, but they have a whole sort of like tech related subcategory. I've presented there a few times. This year, I presented a session on practicing, which I have this habit of proposing these sessions and then realizing I don't know how to talk about that. And then I have this like frantic scramble to make a presentation, which is good for me. But, and then I did last year at TMEA, I did talk on bass, which is natural. And then I used to teach this electronic music, essentially a DJing class, and which is a very weird chapter of my life. But I decided to present on what I did in that. And that was over in that whole tech and the session was packed. It was really interesting. It ended up being one of those things like, I don't know why I did the session because it was one of those things where everyone was like, wow, that's really cool. I have no idea how I would apply that to, like, I love that. I wish I could do that stuff, but I don't know if I can do that. So I don't know if it was ultimately very helpful, but it was kind of fun.
Oh, that's cool. No, you put your creative cap on and you're just like, okay. And you ran with it. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I was so glad to get your email. That like I realized, Heidi's working to do a little music podcast or art music podcast or whatever, unification. And that's something I've thought a lot about over the years. And so it was really fun to get your message.
Oh, well, thank you for reaching out so fast. And I just thought, why not? Like, I know like contrabass and flute, how much do we have in common? But seriously, a lot. And the fact that we're both podcasters who are musicians, I was like, man, this is, our own little weird niche community. And why not reach out and start a conversation? Yeah,
for sure. Well, and I don't necessarily, and I know you do the same thing. My podcast is not necessarily that much about bass. I mean, it kind of is, but you're doing this whole recording, going through these different series and gear and that sort of thing. I mean, today I'm talking to, I was just talking with a trumpet player before you. I'm talking to you, and then I'm talking to Jason Heath, who's a timpanist in the Met. So it's like, all right, I have purportedly a bass podcast. So I'm talking to a trumpet, flute, and timpani. But that's the way it's always been for me. So
cool.
Yeah, sort of the niche, the frame, the convenient, frame is that I'm a bassist and I'm that is the general topic we're revolving around. But we go into, I would say at least 20 to 30% of the people I have on aren't bassists at all.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That you're able to reach across the board into other instruments and their sect. It's so easy. It's kind of like, I don't know, the lunchroom in junior high school, you all tend to sit with the people that you know, but for you to go across the table and say, hey, that's really cool of you.
Yeah, well, it's fun. It's just, for me, the podcast has become a convenient way to do something that's good for me. It's kind of like working out or reading books or something. But because I have the podcast, it forces me or encourages me, or whatever word you want to use, to reach out to people I don't know, to do some research, learn about some things that I would want to be learning about anyway, but we're just so busy in life. And to carve out time with somebody and actually just sit down and talk about something without being interrupted by our phones or this or that. And so it's something that is just good for me in my life. And then it just happens to go out to the public too. So that's the way I think of this. I could lie and say I had a podcast and just talk to you and it would be great. But we're so busy that probably wouldn't happen without that excuse. So that's sort of my podcast rationalization.
Oh my gosh, you are so singing my tune. I feel the same way with my platform. It's like I started this. Actually, my podcast started off as my DMA thesis.
Whoa, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I got to finish and graduate with my DMA because of this podcast. So never did I think, so that was May of 18. So 2 years later, never did I think I would be at, 123 episodes and still doing this every week. And it's because of the people, like you just said, like I got hooked calling up people that I normally would not have had the opportunity to talk to and picking their brains and pulling out those gold nuggets and then getting to publish it and share it with the Flute community. It's like, oh my gosh, it's such a high, it's just like, this is so cool. And I love being to offer that and learning in the process too.
Oh, for sure. For sure. We have so many things to talk about. And by the way, for me, when I do the show, I just sort of let it rip and I have no intro or anything. So if we've started, that's totally cool. If you want to do whatever, I'm down for whatever. But I usually, the more I've done these, the less structure I've had.
I like that. No, I'm keeping all of this. All of this.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Okay. Yes. Awesome. Okay. So I love talking to podcasters, and there aren't that many of us really that are doing, in the classical music world, art music world, whatever label you want to put on it. There were a growing number of us, but still not a lot. And so I was chatting with Elisa Jansen-Jones about a year and a half ago, maybe something like that. And she does a wonderful music education podcast. And so I listened to her latest episode, and then I went back and listened to her very first episode. And I did the same with your podcast, and you were good from that first episode.
Oh, thank you.
Too. And so was Elisa, by the way. But
yeah.
I love just sort of thinking about what I've learned, and I cringe like crazy when I go back and listen to my first episode. But do you feel like you're doing this differently now than you were in 2018 with episode 1?
Oh, good question. Yes, definitely. I'm more myself. I feel more comfortable, and I feel like now I'm talking with a friend, whether it's a guest that I just met, like now, for me to be more open and vulnerable and just, show my true colors. It's a lot easier than thinking, oh, this is a production, and with that production mindset, I could definitely tell, like, if you go back to like series 1 and 2, you can definitely tell that I'm not really Heidi. Like, I'm authentic, but I'm more reserved. And, but now I get to have more fun. And yes, I get to talk about real content, and we are accomplishing things during this time together, but it's with a more fun flair, So I definitely see that growth, which gets me excited.
Well, here's what I used to do. I've been doing this 13 years now, so it's fun to listen back to 2007, Jason. And I have saved in Evernote all the show notes and everything going way back. So what I used to do, and I use this as an example in conferences of what not to do, is I have a list of, I kid you not, 30 questions. I would send people 30 questions.
That's a lot.
So it's like, all right, you've agreed to do this thing, a podcast, which you may or may not have even heard of what a podcast is. And now I've given you this gigantic homework assignment. So, and then so many of them really made an effort to answer those. So my shows were so boring because we would just go through this list of questions I'd sent ahead of time. Do you send people things? Well, I know you do because we converse a little bit. Like, how do you approach like prepping your guests? Maybe that's an interesting thing. Maybe.
No, I appreciate that question. Right now, I still do kind of prep. As you could see, the flutist type A and me kind of crept through in the emails. And I'm like, do you want to talk about this before or not? And you're like, no, we're just going to gel. I'm like, oh, okay. This is a new jive for me, and I appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, and plus with us, you're a podcaster, so you get my world. But yeah, normally with my guests, I do prep them in like a PDF format. Just general audio stuff. A lot of times my guests, they don't realize it, but they will be like talking and walking. And so that shuffling, so just kindly saying, make sure we're sitting down and make sure that, there's a healthy distance between you and the microphone, things like that. And then I've learned that like no more than 5 or 6 questions, no more than that, because like 5 or 6 questions can really go past an hour, and which I don't mind, but I want to be, conscientious of their time and everything. So I do have a format only because like I am an organizational kind of person, and I thrive off of having some kind of format, but we don't really stick to it. Like we start with it and we know like what we're talking about, so that way we can stay on a topic. but the conversation flows and is so organic that sometimes we go off rail, and that's totally cool because then it's natural, you know?
Yeah. I love it. And there's no right or wrong way to do this. And me personally, I have changed a lot over the years, and I'll probably change again in the next few years. So I think it's so interesting how people approach this. What I do these days, and not that this is good or bad, it's just what I'm doing, is I'll reach out to somebody, or a lot of the time at this point, it's somebody who's a listener says, hey, you should talk to this person. So I'll email them, and then if they ask for, hey, what are we talking about here? Or then I don't send them those 30 questions, but I do think, hey, here are a few things that might be interesting to dig into. And I think that that's always helpful. I love talking to people who do a podcast, because I feel like we've probably thought about a lot of the same things, and we don't have so many people to talk about this with. So here's what do you do to prepare before you chat with somebody? What's your process? Do you use an app to collect info? What do you take notes on? What are you doing if you're talking remotely with somebody? Just tell me about your process.
Okay, cool. Well, first I have to eat.
Okay.
I have to. I have learned that I cannot speak well. Especially in a public setting like this, I cannot speak well if I'm not thinking clearly. So I have to eat. Second, I use my iPad Pro, and I love the Notes app. And I just get my stylus and jot down some notes just to kind of focus and just think about what I'm going to be doing during that time. And I check out my guest, for sure. I research the guest. I want to make sure I know them on some kind of level so we can relate. And yeah, that's all I really do. But the key is, I think if anyone was wanting to have a conversation or interview a guest for his or her blog or podcast, that they really get to know the person before calling. I think that's crucial.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, and you've probably run into this too. Congratulations on 123 episodes, by the way. That's awesome. That shows that number means you're sticking to it regularly. I know what that number comes out to in terms of the math. For me, some people that I have on the show, there's a ton of info out there, and they've got interviews up on YouTube, or they've done other podcast interviews, or they've written articles, and it's almost too much info. Some people aren't as public facing that I have on my show, and it can be a real challenge to do the research. Yeah, because some people just aren't it's you should talk to, Buster Skaggs. I'm just making up a name. He's been in Boston Symphony for 38 years, and he doesn't have a YouTube, or he doesn't have a Facebook page. And so those are a unique challenge too. I usually only am talking to those people that have been recommended by somebody else. So then I go to that person who recommended and ask, hey, tell me about Buster. But what I do, and I just think process is interesting. I also am sitting here with my iPad Pro in front of me. So I have a similar, I also use Evernote just because I've been using it forever. So I have a doc on the person that I'm going to have on the show, and I put in their website, their social media feeds, any articles they've written, the text of any email exchanges we've had, text people who recommended them have had. And then on my iPad Pro, I use not the default app, but I use Notability, very similar. And I take a bunch of notes in black. And then when I'm talking to the person, I almost never look at those notes, but I switch the iPad to red. And if they say something that I want to jot down, I write it down in red. And then, so I have a little organizational in me too, and then when I'm going back and I'm working on those notes, I switch the color to green. So that's just my process. Is beforehand black, in the moment red, afterward green. And that seems to keep me organized. I rarely look down at the notes, but it's a really good living document because for me, it's kind of like a talk show. I have people back time and time again. And then I can look at those notes from before, and I can sort of see, what were we talking about? What were we digging into? What was I looking at? It's just a really useful tool for my archives.
Yeah, no, definitely. I have literally a folder for every episode. So when, from episode 0, if you were to go on my computer right now, you would see a folder from episode 0 through 123. And even the unpublished episodes that are coming up through September and October already, it has a folder ready for those documents. And I do show notes. So like I'll do timestamps and links and whatnot. And I want those documents to live in those folders. So that way, same like you, I can go back and reference something if I have a former guest come back on for a current show. Just like yesterday, Eric and I, my husband, he's an audio guy, we recorded 123. And I said, you know what, guys, like there's a lot of similar topics and information that we've talked about back in episode 19 and 63. And I was able to rattle that off because I had that archived. So yeah, I totally get that.
That's cool. How much work does it take to do one episode? If you were to calculate the hours or roughly estimate the hours, you're talking to the person, all the maybe we don't even have to think about the research, although you can add that in if you want. But do you have a rough estimate of how much time you're putting into each one of these?
I think minimum about 5 hours.
Yeah.
I'm doing about like an hour of research, and that will look like, I don't know, like for you, for example, like I'll check out your bio. I'll maybe listen to an episode in full or, part of an episode just to get your style and everything. Maybe I'll listen to you playing, your instrument on YouTube. And so that looks like about an hour, and then maybe even 2, depending on the length of our talk. And then the hour to talk. And then post-production, my husband edits my audio. So I'm very, very thankful for that. But he probably edits about a good hour and a half, depending on, of course, the length of the conversation. And then I do show notes, and then I schedule it through Libsyn. So minimum, I would say about 5 hours.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay.
To me too. That's very, very similar. I also have folks that help me edit, not my significant other, but I've over the years have built up a small team of people that help with this. But there's still a lot on my end that I do. And these days, I'm really into batching. So today, I'm just talking with people, and it's either for the podcast or just for some other purposes. But I generally try to and I don't always stick to this. Life, throws you curveballs, but I try to batch as much as possible. And then I sit down one day every 2 weeks, and it's just podcast day. And I do everything I need to do, including writing up show notes, which I don't do timestamps like you do. That's cool that you do that. And intros and outros, and getting the artwork together, and then getting them to the person who actually schedules and publishes, also through Libsyn, by the way.
Oh, cool.
and so it sounds like you stay ahead. You've got stuff in the can for the next couple months. Is that how you work?
Yeah, I wish you have inspired me. Something on my podcast to-do list is batching more. I do want to batch more because I do feel that I'm not going week to week. I do have, like I mentioned earlier, you referenced my September and October schedule. So I do know 2 months out, my guests and the topics, just so I have time to prepare and schedule. But I wish I was more like you and said, okay, I am just for Monday and Tuesday sitting down and just talking, from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and interviewing my 8 guests for the next 2 months. I wish I did that more because I think there is some time-saving benefits doing it that way. Yeah, so you've inspired me to really get onto that. I do love batching. I'll do these little album art covers, throwback to CDs. Yeah. And so when I market that episode for the week and get people really excited about, episode 123 is coming out this Saturday, I'll throw out album art. And so I do batch those where I'll sit down in PicMonkey in Hootsuite and create all my album covers for the next 2 months, schedule it in Hootsuite. So that way that just goes out without me having to think about it.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. For me, I just like to wear a hat for as long as possible every day. So I love trying to talk, I put my curiosity hat on, and not that I hope that I'm generally curious when I'm not talking to people, but I just find that it helps. And then I'm not trying to deal with a bunch of business email sort of stuff. And then I have a day where I'm just Mr. Technology. It's sitting there and working in Photoshop to get stuff together, working in Audition to sort of stitch things together on my end audio wise, just try to do that. And so I don't know, back when we were traveling, and I know you were doing a lot of traveling, at least looking at your Instagram and what you're doing on the podcast, I was doing a lot of event-based podcasting, right? I was interviewing people live and that kind of thing. I was in Australia. I know you were all over the place. You were like Greece,
yeah,
Romania.
Yeah.
Right? So I was in Australia for a couple of weeks, and I brought my Zoom H6 and a couple of SM58s, which I saw in your Instagram photo. It looks like you use. I love that. I was like, yes, Heidi, that's what I'm talking to you on right now. So
yeah.
I bring that, and so I'll do like 10, 20, 30 interviews, at some event.
Yes.
30, maybe not 30, but a bunch. And then I'm good for like months. Right. And so this doing all the remote chats, though it's great to chat with people. However, I was trying to minimize this. And so I think the podcast is taking up a little more of my time now, just because I'm not, or it's taking up my time in a different way, because there's a little more like, it's sort of like on my schedule in like smaller chunks, where it used to be I would have 2 or 3 days where I was just interviewing.
Wow.
And you were doing live conversations too, weren't you? Or you haven't you?
Yes, I have. No, you're right. Yeah, no, I totally get excited when you just said like the live events. The last live event, well, not the last one, but one prominent event that I was really stoked to be a part of was there's a flute maker called the William S. Haynes Flutes. And they invited me last summer in 2019 to be a part of their exhibitor booth in Salt Lake City, Utah. And so I got to sit there for 4 days and take a chunk of their space and have like 20 guests come through. That sounds like a lot. Maybe 10 to 20 guests a day come through and sit down and talk with me about, anything and everything flute related. And with that, though, I wish I was able to take each interview and just spread it out for the next 6 months. But because they wanted literally everyone to be like in convention mode, they wanted a quick turnaround. They wanted those 10 episodes then aired the next day, while I was interviewing day 2 guests, and then that would be thrown out on day 3, etc. And so that, like, when I came back, I was like, oh my gosh, that was such a blessing to have that opportunity. But if I had to do it again, I think I would ask to spread it out, like the air dates. Yeah. But anyways, with Bulgaria and Greece, that was right before COVID. So I had a European residency where I was asked to go out and give master classes and recitals in Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania for 4 months. And I so jumped on that, because who doesn't want to travel the world with their instrument, right? And so when I was there, I was like, okay, I totally have to leverage my podcast and let flutists know about it, because if no one's listening, what's the point? And so, when I went around from schools to conservatories, I told the kids what I'm doing and what I'm up to. And so in those cases, I was doing live interviews. And when a guest is in the area or something, we'll do live. But most of my interviews are remote.
Yeah. It's interesting. And it's very cool that Haynes did that with you, partnered up with you like that. That's I did a similar thing in 2019 in the summer with D'Addario for the bass convention, our big bass event. I've noticed over the past few years, and I've increasingly done this at conventions. I get good content at conventions, but conventions are such a distracting environment in a lot of ways that I don't necessarily get the best. I love connecting with people in person, but I think if I look back, those aren't necessarily the most insightful interviews. And sorry, folks, if you did one with me at a convention and you're listening, I'm sure it was great. But if I just look, we aren't sitting down for 90 minutes or going deep. My absolute favorite thing, and I've now, who knows when I'll do this again, but is once a year, I've been fortunate to have a bunch of companies sponsor the podcast over the years, and that covers a variety of expenses. But one thing that I do is I bank aside a few $1,000s of that every year and just go on one trip purely for the podcast. So I went in 2018 to New York City for a little over a week and set up at the D'Addario studio in Manhattan and chatted with people and went up to various areas in New York City, brought my microphones, hung out with people at their place, at a local cafe or bar, just chatting. And that's such a cool, so in that experience, I ended up seeing them perform. I ended up spending more time with them. I did a very similar thing in Australia, and those are my favorite because there it's like on location, right?
Yeah.
You're getting to spend some some time with someone in their environment. Now that's time consuming and expensive. And obviously that's like not practical probably for most people doing what we do, but I've loved doing that. But I do, like you're saying, I mean, anybody who's doing a podcast is back to doing remote now. And I've sort of realized that though I think I like the in-person more, it probably is a little bit deeper. We don't have to run off to the next event starting at 11 a.m. or lunch is happening, or they really want to check out that new exhibit in the next booth or that kind of thing.
Or you have a piccolo screaming in your ear.
Or that. Yeah. Our bass conventions tend to be a little, we don't have as many high frequencies. Yeah. So.
The bassier sounds. Oh, shoot. No, that's a great
idea. Bass and flute is a great combo, though.
Yeah, it is. But no, thank you for that tip. That really opened up a new door for me. I hadn't thought about that. But you're right, because if I think back to, and I did love the convention talks, but you're right, they're more like 15 minutes, I'm in and out between events, I'm going to run off to the next exhibit hall. So it's really like a drop-in. But the remote calls are nice too. I do miss the face-to-face interaction, feeling like, I get to see Jason, or I get to, But then you're right, those in-person are so special. And I remember even like if I think the handful in-person interviews I have done with like Dr. Terry Sanchez in Arlington, Texas, Jake Fritkiss, who's a principal flutist in Fort Worth, Texas, I will say I can hear myself now saying, oh, this is so nice. I'm sitting in person with you. I can like see you, touch your hands. Like this is real. This is really beautiful. So there is something special to that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The advice I got, I can't remember where I got it from initially, is like when you're starting out, actually remote is easier because you can have your notes in front of you. You can kind of prepare it. There's something about being like talking one-on-one with someone and you're both holding microphones. Like if you're holding notes, it looks kind of weird. You're like breaking that energy and the eye contact. Like there's a whole special, this is just my opinion, but I've felt this, like, I actually find it's more challenging to talk to somebody in person if I better have really done my research, because I don't know that there's just something about the naturalness of that moment that I don't know. It's kind of a hard thing to describe, but I think that if someone was starting a podcast, I would recommend probably starting remote. Well, you probably have to right now. Yeah. But even so, I think that it's nobody's good at this when they start out. You seem pretty good at this, but it's a skill that you have to develop. And you might think, well, it's just talking. Well, yeah, it is, but there's more to it than that.
Oh, for sure. Because I had my husband do episode 19. That was like literally 2 years ago to the date. It was like published August 4th, 2018. Anyways, I know it sounds like I'm throwing him under the bus, and I swear I'm not. He's going to laugh at this. But when we were done, he was like, oh my gosh, just even saying one sentence was so hard. And he goes, why is this so difficult? It's just talking. And I said, no, it's not. I mean, it's an art. Communicating is an art. You have to listen, you have to speak, you have to know your points and things like that. But then, fast forward 2 years later, we did 5 episodes back to back, and he was so much more improved. He was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm gelling now. I get the flow. This is more fun. I know what to expect. So you're definitely right.
It's a weird thing to get used to. And I know that a lot of people, me included, really struggle with the imposter syndrome kind of thing with this. I remember back to 2007, and I already, I had a successful career-ish, freelancing in Chicago, teaching. I'd even started to get some attention for writing, for blogging, for various things. But I started the podcast a couple of years into putting out content, and I was awkward. And I felt like, who the heck am I to be asking questions of any of these people? I think that's part of why I had that 30 question list. It was like my question armor. And I sort of forget what that feeling is like now, but it's because like whatever number I'm at now, it's just sort of, I'm just used to it. But I'm assuming you felt yourself sort of getting some chops as you kept going, or have you had a similar experience?
Oh my gosh, yes. And before I answer, I'm going to I don't want to forget. Congratulations to you for over 700 episodes. That is phenomenal. When I saw that number, my mouth dropped. It really did. I was just like, I know what it takes to do 100. I do not know what it takes yet to do 700. And so for you to be that diligent and consistent, I'm sure your community is so thankful to you.
Yeah, I don't understand that number when I look at it, because I think back, it's like, oh, I talked to that person 250 episodes ago. It's very, I don't understand it, but I guess it's just what happens when you keep doing something consistently.
Yeah, you must really love it, because you don't do something like that if you're not passionate about it.
Well, I love it because I think it makes me a better person. I mean, that really, it's my reasons for doing it are not selfish is the wrong word, but they're definitely, it's something I realized. Probably I didn't realize it until 2015 or so, but I realized that there was benefit to doing this without there being a show. I could lie and say that I had a show and chat, and I would get similar benefit, and putting it out in the world is just an added bonus. Mm-hmm. So I think I didn't know what I was doing when I was starting out. I still kind of don't know what I'm doing, but I know more than I did back 13 years ago.
Wow.
So
that's amazing. No, I totally resonate with that, because my friend Rachel, she's a really creative flutist and plays so expressively through her music. And she's an LA flutist, actually. And she came to me and said, I really want a series in October about how to play more expressively through your flute, and let's ask these guests and blah, blah, blah. And I said, yes. And she's like, oh, Heidi, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm going to sound so selfish right now. I'm doing this because I want to learn. And it's really like, honestly, I am a passionate teacher. So I do love sharing. I love talking and sharing ideas. But at the end of the day, you're right. Like, I have grown so much as a person, as a musician, as a flutist, because of this platform. It's insane. And so, that totally resonates with me.
Yeah, it's such a weird platform, because you and I, we're just here chatting. It's just the two of us chatting. But there's somebody out there. They're running along that lake right now, and they're listening, and they're like in that conversation. I just think of it, it's like learning in public, kind of.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Because I mean, it's like the world's oldest for, two people talking. That's been happening for a while. But just the unique medium of podcasting, and there's no time limit to this. There's no one who's telling you what to talk about, how to do it. No, it must be 27 minutes long, and we have to take a break here. Or no, you can't express it that way, or you can't have that person on, or you can't this or that. I love that you approach your podcast in this sort of series way. Was that? I mean, it looks like it was an idea from the beginning. What inspired you to do that? I think it's very cool, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, it kind of, again, just because of why and how I started the podcast for my DMA thesis really lent itself to those series. And I was thinking about that the other day. And if you look, like, series 1 is all about health and like holistic approaches. And 2 is about, your studio organization. But then series 3, I just kind of went off and just started getting messy. Like, I interviewed my friend Sam about his dissertation. Then I interviewed an orchestral player from Finland, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of went off the rail there, which there's nothing wrong with. Like, if you wanted to talk to, an orchestral player one day and then an educator the next day, I think that's awesome too, because, these ideas are always flowing. But then in series 4, I come back to this like template of series. And the reason I did that is because, well, series 1 and 2, like, I needed to have some organization for my committee. Like that was a must. And so I think my podcasting journey was really interesting or unique because of that setup. Like, I had to get approval of the topics. I had to have it a little bit more research-based for the committee and for my degree. I mean, what podcaster starts it off based on a dissertation? Do you know what I mean?
You may be the only one.
And so because of that, and I went off, series 3 and got a little messy with, these random topics, I went back series 4 to the series idea because I really liked having a theme for the month. Not that I won't revisit that theme later. So like, I don't know, December of 2018, I think I talked with like 5 or 6 different composers who wrote and who write flute works. It's not that I will not visit composers again, but I will do it when like I have a month open where I can like go through that theme. And I like that because I feel like we can, myself and the listener and the guest, we can kind of dive into an arena a little bit more and compare like a Daniel Dorff, he's a composer, to Valerie Coleman. So if like my listeners hear, me asking the same question, like, hey, what's your compositional creative process like, right? And December 1st, they hear Daniel Dorff saying, oh, I do XYZ, right? And then Valerie Coleman next week on December 8th says, oh, she does ABC. As a teacher, I like having students and listeners alike connect those dots. And if like that topic can be kind of consistent week to week for a while, then maybe they're connecting those dots quicker. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense.
Okay.
You're reminding me of a project I did maybe 3 years ago with a high school senior, actually in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, named Bailey Brown, who has since gone off to, I think, NEC, New England Conservatory. But she had, and this was an idea inspired from the bass professor at UT Arlington. So Jack Unziker, sorry, way too much background information. But anyway, he said, what about doing a series where Bailey asks a series of questions about going to college, things that a high school senior would want to know. And you have the professor from Juilliard, Rice, everywhere, USC, you name it, answer. So I sketched it all out, very ambitious project, trying to figure out how to do it. I ended up contacting all these people, giving them my Google Voice number so they could just call and it would just get emailed to me. And I put together this thing. It was the most complicated thing I've ever done, but it was I think 30 college faculty answering this high school senior's questions. And so I love hearing, multiple takes on the same perspective. So I think it's very cool where you're giving me a lot of ideas with the way that you approach your podcast. Why a podcast? I love asking people who have started, or now you have done it for quite a number of episodes. Why, of all the things you could have done in terms of content, why a podcast?
Oh my gosh, you have so many good questions. I'm like, okay, I am hoping that I'm answering the questions and I'm actually making sense here. Well, one, like I noticed you started in 2007 and my podcast started in 2018. So podcasting, I think, if I remember my stats right, really became a thing like around 2010. And it's still growing. Like, I still think this platform has a long way to go. But in 2018, when we were thinking of my project, we had to think of something creative and interdisciplinary. So meaning like I had to use different fields for the younger listeners. I had to use like the arts and music and technology. And I had to show my committee that I'm packaging it in a very unique way. And so podcasting really fit that bill. And then, the fact that the platform around 2018 had really grown. And so it was catching people's eyes. I think that was really key. And at the time, there was only probably 2 or 3 other flute podcasts out there, Rebecca Fuller and the Flute View, and maybe one other podcast. So there was a lot of room for growth and expansion within the flute podcasting niche. But what I've learned over the years is podcasting, I think for musicians in particular, can be really beneficial. Like, think about it. So like, if I'm talking to, again, Gary Shocker, a prominent flute composer, and say I wanted to interview him through a blog, or like we have a Flute Talk magazine or the Flutist Quarterly. I could call him, right, and type out his answers verbatim and then get approved and then put it in the magazine. But it's not oral. And think about what we do as musicians. It's an oral art. So if you can hear the composer, Gary, like having his inflection on a certain word in his sentence, or hearing the scratchiness in his voice because, I don't know, he has a cold, or him in the one episode, I think he was like episode, I want to say 35 or 36, you hear his grandfather clock chiming in the background. I mean, you can't get that through a piece of paper, and that's one thing I've learned throughout the years is just what we do as musicians as an oral art, and this podcasting is another oral art, and how there's so many parallels with those two worlds.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really interesting point about the fact that we're musicians and the oral art. I've never, I don't know if I've ever really thought about that and the particular appeal of music podcasters. I did a conversation with somebody. I can say it is Scott Pingle. He's the principal bass of the San Francisco Symphony. He played with Metallica for this opening concert for the new basketball arena here in San Francisco. Biggest audience that's ever seen a solo bass. Scott had a giant bass solo in this concert. So I talked with Scott about that in October, I think, and I could have put that out the next day, but it's also coming out in our version of Flute Talk, the bass world, and it is still not out. I have been sitting on this episode it'll have been a year. Wow. So just the amount of time it takes to get something on paper, and you're not going to hear Scott's voice. You're going to get it in print, but more, you get all of the other information that I'm sure we musicians tap into, the excitement in Scott's voice and all that. I mean, podcasting for me, it's a really cool medium for so many reasons. It's very flexible. I mean, it could be an interview show. I've done, when I do talks at a conference, sometimes I'll repurpose those and do a solo show on those. I've done live events where I'm just recording the event, or we do a panel discussion that I record. I put out all music every once in a while. It's one of those that it's a lower touch medium than video. I think that it's probably like 10x the amount of work to do a video, and it's one of those mediums that people are generally consuming when they're doing something else. Maybe they're driving, or they're cooking, or they're walking the dog, or they're cleaning, and it's this time in a person's day, and there's actually a fair amount of it for most people that they could be learning and want to be learning. It's not. It's kind of a blue ocean compared to like trying to do something like video or text, when there are so many other things competing for your time. You're not going to like listen to a YouTube episode. I mean, maybe you are, but a podcast, and those who find podcasts tend to get really into podcasts.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, so I think it's my experience. It's been a bafflingly challenging thing to grow in terms of marketing and social media or the like, because it's such a different activity. If you're like scrolling through Instagram, and I love what you do on Instagram, by the way, I'm taking a lot of inspiration from the way you're approaching your podcast. But someone who's maybe at the grocery store scrolling through Instagram, to get them to all of a sudden drop what they're doing, go to another app, subscribe, and listen to a 45-minute audio episode. That's a big ask. So I think that's one of the most challenging things. Have you thought about that, or like what strategies have you used to try to get people to the podcast? I think it's one of the hardest things to do.
Oh my gosh, I should be asking you that question since you have like 2 million downloads.
I could tell you things I've done, but I'm more than happy to.
Oh my gosh, I am still learning, and I think I will forever be learning in this arena, because when I went to school, it was to learn how to play the flute. How to teach. I didn't learn marketing. I didn't learn business. And so I'm getting life lessons right now. Of course, I'm getting some experts along the way. My friend Taylor Rossi, who's a flutist and a media guru, she helped me last December kind of vamp up my Instagram a little bit. And I'm listening to podcasts on marketing, like Kim Walsh-Phillips and other people in the arena. So I'm always learning. But to answer your question, yeah, it's hard to get them to hit subscribe. It really is. Like, maybe I'm finding that like people will like maybe listen to a particular episode if it really intrigues them, but to get them to go one step further and hit the subscribe button is something that I'm dealing with. And I know I'm not the only one, just because one, you brought it up, how it can be not painful, but I'll use that word. But my husband is an audio video engineer for other podcasters. And so he says all the time, like they're talking in his ear and they're talking about, this or that content. And this very topic will come up, and he'll get off done editing and he'll be like, you're not the only one, Heidi. Like, podcasters who are in the hunting, gardening, knitting realm, they are all saying the same thing. Like, how the heck do we get them to subscribe? So if there are any tips, I think it's being consistent on social media, like letting your audience know, like, some kind of schedule, or, just a quick shout out, like episode 123 is coming out this Saturday. or that really helps. The one thing that I'm starting new is, and you have it, is a newsletter. I have not done that before, but I think a newsletter can make the 360 community feel like more like a community, conversing through this newsletter. But yeah, so I don't know if there were any helpful tips in that, but what do you do? Because I'm dying to know.
Yeah, for sure. And that's all that consistency is so key. And I'm glad that you're launching a newsletter. I just actually signed up for it on your website. So I'm looking forward to checking that out. So yeah, it's a tough thing and it's changed a lot. If we rewind to 2007, it's like, who are you? What's a podcast and why should I be on it? When I was like approaching any guest, let alone like that was before, I think the iPhone came out in around 2007, maybe. Yeah. I don't remember exactly, but I definitely launched before the iPhone, which kind of kicked off the concept of listening to podcasts in a more streamlined mobile way. I think it's so much easier now here in 2020. And so the big challenge the way to market something like this. This is a long form audio content. It's a tough thing to market in short burst attention, deficit sort of places like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. I don't think many podcasters find a lot of success there. So like just stop doing this activity that these tech companies have built, have made billions to have you do, like scroll through and watch these very quick things and go to another app and subscribe to this thing. And maybe I don't know what a podcast is. So the big challenge is if you're trying to market your podcast, in general, it's still like maybe 50% of the people in the U.S., and I think that percentage is lower outside of the U.S., listen to podcasts regular. So you've got a 50-50 shot of someone even knowing what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So I have changed the ask to be much more join my email list. And I've just learned that I have built this community unintentionally at first and then more intentionally the last 4 or 5 years. And people interact with what I put out and people I profile in different ways. Some people are just like, hey, I love the Instagram feed. I'm like, okay, great. I guess so that's the way they think. Oh yeah, the Contrabass Conversations, they're on Instagram. That's great. Some people they love the Facebook community group. Oh, it's so great. Or they think that's what I do or we do. Some people listen to the podcast. Some people think of what I do as a weekly newsletter, and that's all great. And then the one thing that has persisted the last few decades, couple decades at least, is email. And love it or hate it, email seems to be here for the long term, at least as far as we can tell. So getting into people's email box is definitely the best option, I think, and then educating them on what a podcast is. So I resisted building up email. I don't think I really started building up an email list until like 2017, which is pathetic considering that was 10 years into my journey. But now when I put out an email about a podcast, that drives the downloads.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so I don't necessarily push it that much through. I mean, I always, I put out that a new episode is out and that kind of thing about the person, I definitely try to be active, and I actually should say we, because I have a team and so people help me with this. But so I find that to be helpful. One thing that has been very helpful over the years, and it's through Libsyn, so the company you also use, is I made an app. And I did that back in 2015. And the app has been particularly good on the Android side, the non-iOS side. I've seen it on so many people's phones. It's like think about it. If you can have app real estate on someone's phone, that is powerful. And so, yes, you maybe only have a 1 in 2 shot of someone listening to podcasts or do that. Or they might be like, oh yeah, great. I don't listen to podcasts though. There are a lot of people that just don't listen to podcasts, but everybody pretty much, I mean, a massive percentage of people know what it means to download an app. So I say, hey, download my app. Check out the app. And the app is just the podcast in disguise, but it gets on the phone. If they choose to turn on notifications, they can get notifications. So that has been helpful, particularly in the Android world. And then I think the biggest thing, which I think you're doing a great job on this, is just like making the best possible thing you can and making something that if you're doing something that is interview based that has a guest, making it something your guest wants to shout out to the world, because that's the way you really grow, is to get other people talking about you, and if you can get 2 or 3 people from their audience to actually connect and listen and subscribe, you're good long term, because you, Heidi, are the main character in your podcast. That's the thing. You're profiling all these other people, but as they're running around the lake or doing whatever they're doing, they're listening to somebody else, but they're also listening to you. So they, that's the thing that builds like massive, pays off in the long run and leads to all sorts of podcast growth, but other opportunities, which I'm sure you've had over the last couple of years. Like, I'd love to know, like, how has the podcast affected other things you do, which is kind of a broad question, but like my career, I think of as very much because of my podcast career at this point. I do all sorts of things, but the podcast has been the fuel for really my career at this point. How does it play into what you do outside of simply producing the podcast? What opportunities have come of it?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I'm still a newbie, I feel like, especially hearing your journey. It's so cool to hear that, you started the podcast and smartphones weren't even a thing yet. I was like, oh my gosh. There was a day when we weren't using iPhones. When was that date? But yeah, so I feel like such a newbie still in this, but there are amazing opportunities stemming from my platform. For example, income, bringing in different revenues of income. I'm able to offer services. People get to know you. Like you just said, like running around the lake, you get to hear my voice, as whether it's pleasant to your ear or unpleasant. I have such a Chicago accent. My vowels are so nasally. I don't even like listening to my own voice. But you get to hear my voice on a weekly basis. And so whether you realize it or not as the host, like you are making and building these like really intimate connections and relationships to your audience. And so because of that, they get to trust you and know you and learn about you. And so then I'm able to, without sounding sleazy or without, marketing myself like crazy and being an awful like car saleswoman, I get to say like, hey, a competition's coming up. If you need some help with it, like shoot me a message and I can give you a lesson on this repertoire. Other services, like I'm starting these coaching packages where I can help maybe students like with their school applications, like they're editing their resume and their teaching philosophy, if it's a job application, or their cover letter. That's something I want to bring to the world. So hopefully that gets to go full-fledged. But other opportunities, not, to sound again, sleazy. I swear I'm not. It's just, relationships are being formed. And one of my friends who's a flutist out in Colorado, she teaches flute in Denver. She reminds me probably once every couple months when we talk, she's like, you have something so good here. Like you are able to again, like we were talking in our conversation, this is full circle. Like I'm able to talk to people that I normally wouldn't be able to talk to. And so because of that, new relationships are being formed and the new opportunities are being formed. So like Kathy Blocky, she is the inventor of the Pneumo Pro. It's this yellow plastic flute head joint that has fans and wheels. And I've been so blessed lately that she's showed such an interest in me and the platform that she's like hired me to help her market her products and books and services and her classes. She's offered my husband audio and video gigs. And do you know what I mean? So it just spirals from there. Like it could have just been, just an episode of us talking about her Kinderflute for 40 minutes, which was great. But then to have this like relationship built and the trust built, then other opportunities are stemming from that. And so I'm starting to see that now, not just for my own business as a flutist and as a teacher, but also it's piggybacking off of my husband's company, which is really cool because like he's been recording flute for like 15 years. He didn't plan on it. He's a blues guitarist. And here, like all of his audio and video gigs are coming from flutists. And so when the listener knows that they can trust me and get to know me, then they're like, oh, Heidi's husband. Oh, I have a competition coming up. I need him just to quickly edit, the intro, the outro, the whatever, and package it up nicely and master it for me. And then they feel like they know him too through me. And so I'm seeing his business grow because of the podcast.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's it makes sense. I mean, the relationship building thing it's just sort of an organic byproduct of what you're doing, what we're doing. And I don't know if I had approached my podcast with that as the goal, I don't know that it would have succeeded. But I think if you're curious and at least for me personally, that has been an unintended side effect. And the more you do, the more you become that linchpin to that community. Oh, Heidi knows so-and-so. Heidi knows everybody. It's remarkable. So it's so super cool to hear that. I guess colleague would be the word to use of ours in the podcasting world. Sean Perrin, who does the Clarinet podcast, he's built an incredible career with that as a big component of what he does. And he works now for Bakun Clarinets, which is another company owned by Eastman Music Company, by the way, which I work for.
Wow.
so Haynes, Bakun, Eastman, through all three of us indie podcasters, we've at least worked with in some capacity.
Wow.
And I'd never set out to do that, but it's totally because of the podcast. I do all sorts of talks and workshops and stuff, that sort of thing, when or I did. We'll see when I start again as a result of the podcast. I didn't intend to do that, but I totally have because of my podcast career. And it all really happened for me. I kind of have had two podcasts. I started my podcast in 2007 and I kind of quit doing it around 2010. And you can tell I started teaching high school orchestra, and you can see when I started high school orchestra by the day that I stopped podcasting because I got too busy with the job. And then my wife, and I was in Chicago, by the way. Do you have some Chicago roots? Since you got to Chicago?
I'm from Chicago.
Oh. Okay. Well, I was 23 years in Chicago, and my wife, who was a harpist, ended up going to medical school at University of Chicago. We met at Northwestern, the music school, and then she matched here in San Francisco for residency. So I was thinking, 23 years in one place, subbing in the ensembles and playing in the regional orchestras and teaching it to Paul and doing all these sort of things. I knew my career, and the podcast was like a side thing. I knew that I was going to blow up my in-person work, right? And move out to San Francisco. And who knows if we'd stay in San Francisco? Maybe we'd leave again. So I was sort of thinking about my career, and I was thinking, well, I'll just try to find an orchestra job around San Francisco. And you know what I did? So this is 2010 to 2015. I paid my Libsyn hosting fee, but I don't even think I logged in. And in 2015, I was looking and seeing, are there jobs in San Francisco? What am I going to do? Am I going to walk dogs? Well, I'm scared of big dogs. Am I going to drive Uber? Well, we don't even have a car that works for Uber. So what am I going to do? I'm like this useless skill. And there's no demand for more freelance bass players in San Francisco. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So I knew it was good. And so I thought, and people over the years had kept on saying, hey, why don't you start up that podcast again? Hey, I used to love listening to you back in the day. And I logged into Libsyn and I looked at some of these episodes, and some of these episodes had like 25,000 downloads. And I'm thinking like, what the heck is this? And I started to think, okay, I loved my teaching jobs. I was thinking, okay, maximum, I'm affecting maybe 200 kids a day. Wow. I mean, this is kind of a sober way to look at it, but that's the bet. 200 kids a day are kind of paying attention to me, along with all these other classes they have and activities. Okay, that's my impact. Now let's look in here. Whoa, way more than 200 people are interacting with stuff I'd put out in the past every single day. And I know it's not a direct correlation, but I was thinking, it made me think like, what if I just pretended the podcast was my job? What if I just moved out to San Francisco and see how long I could pretend I had a job doing this until I ran out of money? And it was a little scary because San Francisco is not cheap. And you can't, it was, but I woke up Monday through Friday, 8 a.m., sat down and did the podcast, whatever that meant. And I had a couple moments where I thought like, ooh, should I take a few gigs were coming in. And I had this moment when there was a bass festival in Prague. This is like a few months after I'd moved to San Francisco. Okay. So like the money was definitely not out, but running out. And I thought, okay, I could stay and play. I don't remember what the gig was, Modesto Symphony, or I could go to Prague on my own dime. And I was like, and interview people and meet all these people. And I had this real like two forks in the road moment. And I thought, I'm going to Prague. It'll work. I talked to the people who organized the event. They comped my ticket, my admission. So I thought, okay, I'll get myself to Prague in the Airbnb. And I came back from Prague and I logged into Libsyn again, and I could see in my download numbers like a new base level. Like so many more people were listening to podcasts because they'd met me in person. Because I had all these guests leads I generated from the festival. I started to get more international, and I just started to take it more seriously. And it's really interesting. And when I started to think about it and pretend that it was my job, it actually essentially became my job. And I have one of those careers that a lot of podcasters have. And it sounds like you are doing or on your way to doing, or really are doing, it sounds like, which is like, my podcast is not necessarily, I'm not paying my bills on the podcast, but all my work has really like can be fairly directly traced to this thing I do, this weird thing I do, talking about myself into a microphone. So.
Right. It is a weird thing that we do. No, and I really resonate with that. I thank you so much for sharing your story and being so open about it. I do want to say, like, because I don't explain myself very well and I'm not very good with my words sometimes. When I talked about, how different opportunities have been stemming from the podcast, don't think for you 360 listeners, I started this off hoping to get a dime. Trust me, I am not rolling in the money over here. But those opportunities, like this different lessons and coaching packages and things like that, have organically happened because listeners will come to me and say, I need help with XYZ. So I just kind of want to put that out there because I totally get what you just said with deciding, flat out, like, this is my job. So like after Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria, I came back, did some more job applications, and I had this wonderful opportunity for 2020 to 2022 to teach outside of Shanghai, China. And I was going to go, and I was doing the work visa, starting in April, and July 1st, the school called and said the Chinese government has suspended all work visas, particularly from America, because the drama teacher's coming from the UK, and I think he's still hired, but they canceled my contract. And so I was devastated. I was so devastated. I'm like, I worked so hard, what it's like to get a full-time music job. Those are golden. And I was stoked to work with, flutists on the other side of the world. I mean, I just love to travel and I love to connect with people through music like that. And so July 2nd, I'm like, okay, what do I do? Like, I understand a lot of people are in the same shoes I am because of COVID. I mean, we are all feeling it. And Eric looked at me and he's like, I have been saying this for 2 years, Heidi K. Begay. This is your job. This is your job. This podcast has been given to you. It's fallen into your lap and you need to run with it because it's something very special. And I know it's special, but when I started it, of course, it was for the thesis, but then I continued it because I saw something from it. I was growing and it felt like a hobby. You know what I mean? And then at some point, like, I think now because China canceled, I've made this shift. Everything is closed. Like academia right now, they're not hiring. And there might be one flute job, for this upcoming year for like 1,000 DMA graduates. It's insane. And I'm sure the odds are the same in the string world, and that's okay, and the fact that I have been given this amazing platform and doing these weird things that we do, it's like I had this shift of, it's not a hobby anymore. I can actually make this into my job. And so what you said really spoke to me. Yeah,
it's a hard thing for me to it still is a hard thing for me to wrap my brain around. I mean, I guess, state of the affairs in the world now, everybody's kind of in this, or everybody essentially is in this situation where we can't interact or play gigs or teach in person or all these sort of things. And I feel like I'm such a people person. And it really felt weird to say, no, I'm not going to surround myself with people and go in and, teach high school, which I loved doing, or like go play a bunch of gigs. I'm going to like sit by myself at the computer. That's what my calling is. That felt very like solitary. But I'll tell you, it's so funny because I mean, we're chatting right here, which is great. Although if anybody was looking, we would just look. If someone looked at me right now, they'd think I was an insane person just talking to myself. And then I really do look like an insane person talking to myself, doing these intros and outros. It's so solitary in so many ways. But then I went to Australia and I'm meeting all these people who said, "Oh, I've been listening to you for 10 years. I love so much." And it's just so crazy how this can spread and can reach people. One of my favorite people that's emailed me over the past few years, and I have this weird Dear Abby kind of role in the bass world where people sign up for my email list and then they write about where they and this one person, he said, I'm listening to you from the jungles of Indonesia. He's like a military contractor or something like that, and he's like, I've just had such a great time. And he said, and I remember back in the mid 2000s when I was in rural Kazakhstan, and I thought, I didn't even know there was urban Kazakhstan. There actually is, but I didn't. But I was just like thinking, wow, there's some guy out in some sort of Humvee or something, like listening to these bass podcasts, that I'm doing from my condo in California or in my apartment in Chicago or whatever. And it's so interesting because it feels so solitary in so many ways, and especially when I'm not doing, this is like my most social day. A lot of it's just like me by myself. Yeah. But it's really the most social thing and the most public facing thing I could be doing. So it's interesting, but I love what I can tell you enjoy it. Yeah. Just talking to you now and listening to your podcasts and seeing what you do. And you're building like what you're doing is a good example of what can you do right now, right? Yeah, you can't like make the world create a bunch of flute jobs, which are, I know, insanely impossible to get, even in the best of circumstances. Same thing for any instrument or anything, right now. But what can you do? You can do this. You can show up. You can get better. You can talk to people. You can find out how they're doing. And so it's a proactive and it's kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I could talk about that for a million years. But that's why I reached out to you and the other music podcasters, because it's like, if you look at my season from 2018 when I graduated and I was beefing up my CV, I was like, I know I need to get international experience. I know I need to do blah, blah, blah in order to even be considered by these search committees. I was running the podcast and I felt like that was a valley in my life. I'm like, oh my gosh, I just spent I worked on 3 degrees. Where's the light at the end of this tunnel? Like, where am I going to be used? Where can I teach? Where can I play? In 2 years, I felt like from 18 to 20, it was like a valley in my life. And I had this epiphany, like, that's when you plant. That's when you grow your seeds, because then later you can reap the benefits of your harvest. And so when COVID hit and I was listening to and I was watching the newsfeed through Facebook and Instagram of all my friends, their world got turned upside down. And they're like, what? My playing gigs are gone. What? I don't get to teach. What am I going to do? I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is the message I want to spread right now is like, if this is a valley for you, start planting your seeds, because when this whole COVID mess goes away, hopefully 6 months, 1 year, 2 years from now, you'll be so glad that you looked and took this time. And of course, like you're allowed time to grieve and mourn and do what you got to do, but use this time wisely, because in a year from now, you'll look back and think, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I used this time to do what, like you just said, to learn, to talk to people, to learn new skills. Like I've had to learn how to do some basic audio editing skills. I'm learning how to market. I'm learning how to, do things I never thought I'd have to learn how to do. And now it's in my wheelhouse. And I'm like, oh, as a flutist, I'm going up to corporate sponsors and I sound like a salesperson. And I'm like, who is this person?
Right.
Like I'm using terms and stuff that does not normally come out of Heidi's mouth. I'm like, this is so weird and foreign to me, but it's amazing. And I'm so blessed for the opportunity. And so like what you just said, like, what can you do now? And so if like, there's any beacon of hope that, I and you and maybe other music podcasters can give is like, there are opportunities out there. You have to just get really creative and, ask and open up your mouth and talk to people, and you might come across this really neat project that you never, ever dreamed of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. I hear that.
Yeah.
Heidi, you rock. I will link up to everything you got out there for my audience. We want to put this out on our respective shows. Is that cool?
Yeah, I think that would be awesome.
I love it. Yeah, it's great. Anything else you want to dig into for the show? We didn't hit?
I think we hit a lot. Like, I think, was there anything that you wanted to say about like how you're able to like sustain your platform through like sponsorships or anything like that? Or is that something that you don't want to touch on?
No, I'm more than happy to. I'll be brief. I decided, I decided to make the I'll tell the short version of the story. But I decided back in 2015, okay, I'm going to pretend this is my job, move out here. And you know what? I started to get the audience started to build up. I started taking it more seriously, but I also started to work a little too hard at like monetizing my audience. And I think I was just, I was watching that dollar amount go down in the bank account and realizing my lack of Uber driving or dog walking skills. And I was trying a lot of things that just weren't really a good fit. And I just needed to give it some time was the problem. And I know like we all want to, make things happen as quickly as possible. And probably especially now for people, if they lost all their work and are, have no idea when things are coming back. But I was just trying too hard. I was like making courses for people for things they didn't really want. I was like I was just trying too many different things.
Okay.
And then some of the seeds I had started to plant started to come to fruition. I started to get some more opportunities. And I finally decided, okay, this podcast is kind of its own thing. There's the Jason Heath career, and then there's the podcast. Okay. And any money that comes into the podcast just goes right back into the podcast. And that means either like hiring or upgrading, getting software or all these little expenses, email service. There's not a ton, but you add it up, and there's funding some of these trips that I was talking about, and then there's the Jason Heath career. And I just try to like let the podcast be the podcast. And when there's a natural something happening, like I went over to England right before COVID and filmed a couple of double bass courses for this company, Discover Double Bass. I will certainly be talking about those on the podcast, but I just have tried to let them sort of be their own thing. That has seemed to work really well for me. But I just think anybody who's planning on starting their own thing, and I wish there were more music podcasts out there. I wish there were more bass podcasts out there. I have had everybody who has started a bass podcast, I think I've had on my podcast and shouted out their podcast, and I just welcome more people. I think it only I don't think it's competition at all. I think it's just, if anything, it's just going to encourage more people to discover podcasting, and it gives us a chance to have conversations with multiple people. I've been wishing there were more people in this space since 2007. So it makes me happy. And I'm told by the folks at Libsyn not to talk about there being a discoverability problem in podcasting, because there's apparently not, but there kind of is, because I didn't know about your podcast, and I wish, and you've been doing 136 episodes. I should have found out about it. There's just not a lot. I wish that there was more back and forth with the people doing what we do. And I think that a lot of people would learn and benefit who might want to get into what we're doing, because there's no manual. I was just talking to somebody who's a very successful musician who's planning on doing a podcast, and he was just didn't know where to start. So yeah, I guess I just decided to let the podcast be its own thing and let my career just sort of happen and a lot of it is, generally a result of the podcast, but not trying to directly monetize the podcast. That seemed to, I think it made me a little more relaxed. Maybe a little more eager to joke around and not really care. This episode has to do well. I don't care, So I think it took some of the pressure off that I was applying.
No, that's really great advice. Yeah. And I totally agree with welcoming other flute podcasters or other clarinet, anyone. There are so many unique voices and experiences and walks of life. And my talk and my journey is not even going to sound remotely the same as Catherine's journey, Right. And there's a prominent flutist, Amy Porter. She's the professor at University of Michigan. And she just started her own Porter pod during quarantine. And I was like, yes, people know Amy Porter. And so if they're typing in flute podcast, I'm going to pull up. I might be the 5th or 6th one down below Amy Porter. But guess what? Like, just platforms in general for the other flute podcasters that are already out there will give visibility. And a really great piece of advice that I received from someone is the rising tide will rise all boats. And so, you know, like you said, there's no, I don't see it as competition. I welcome it because it's like, oh, good. Like she is a tenured flute professor at Michigan. She has, oh my gosh, oodles and oodles of experience and gold nuggets to share that are going to sound different than mine, you know, and, you know, to the other flute podcasters out there like Rebecca Fuller, she focuses on beginner flutists. And so everyone's platform is going to be different and unique. And that's what we want.
Yeah, and you get those super fans that want to listen to flute podcasts all day, and they're bummed out when they run out. You know, I mean, that's what that it's a true fan medium, and so yeah, it's like I even though I subscribe to a disturbing number of podcasts, probably over 100. I just I'm a compulsive podcast subscriber. I still I look up and I was like, oh no, my favorites are out. Oh, what am I going to do? And so I think I'm right there with you.
Yeah,
Heidi, this has been great.
Yeah.
We'll share it out to our audiences. And we should do it again sometime. And whenever in-person things happen again, I hope that we get to meet, whether at a convention or when I'm in Fort Worth or you're out here in California or whatever. It'd be great to hang out in person.
Yeah, I totally agree. My door's always open, and I hope we get to meet in person, and that would be great. And thank you so much for your advice and your time and just everything. I've learned so much from you and just your willingness to sit down with me, and it means a lot.
Hey, likewise. This has been great. People love this. Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah. And you have a great day, and we'll be in touch, and I can't wait to hear it go out.
Yeah, likewise. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
All right, bye-bye.
All right, bye.
Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. For more information, please visit HeidiKBigay.com. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review in the iTunes store. Let's talk about flute.